The splash of muddy water was deliberate, meant to humiliate. Dorian Blake's laughter echoed from his luxury SUV as he watched the elderly street cleaner dripping on the corner. Just another powerful man tormenting someone he deemed invisible. But Langston Rhodes wasn't simply an old man with a broom. He was a decorated captain who'd once pulled a young Lieutenant Blake from a jungle ambush, a whistleblower who'd survived assassination attempts, a man who carried military secrets buried as deep as the empty grave marked Tyrone Merritt. When the viral video hit the internet, it cracked open 20 years of carefully constructed anonymity. Now, as federal agents raid Blake's mansion and long-silenced witnesses emerge from shadows, the world is learning what happens when you mistake quiet dignity for weakness. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways, delivered by the very hands once considered too insignificant to notice. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The early morning rain pattered against the windows of downtown storefronts, turning the normally pristine sidewalks into slick pathways dotted with puddles. Most people hurried past, hunched beneath umbrellas, eyes cast downward to avoid the spray from passing cars. Langston Rhodes didn't have that luxury. His weathered hands gripped the long-handled broom as he methodically swept debris from the street corner, his city maintenance uniform already damp from the steady drizzle. At 68, his movements were still precise and deliberate, a testament to decades of discipline that rain couldn't wash away. "Morning, Mr. Rhodes," called a barista, rushing to open the coffee shop behind him. Langston's face creased into a warm smile. "Morning, Sarah. Looks like we're in for a wet one today." "You staying dry out here?" she asked, fumbling with her keys. "Dry enough," he replied with a quiet chuckle that suggested he'd weathered far worse than a Monday morning downpour. The financial district was coming to life around him. Men and women in tailored suits and designer raincoats streamed from luxury. Cars and taxis, most barely acknowledging Langston's presence. He was part of the scenery to them, like the street lamps or mailboxes, necessary but invisible. 3 blocks away, Dorian Blake drummed his fingers impatiently against the leather interior of his black Escalade. At 45, Dorian had built Blake Tech into a multi-billion-dollar empire through ruthless determination and a complete disregard for anything that stood in his way. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, glaring at the traffic jam ahead. Construction. Barriers narrowed the normally 3-lane road down to 1, creating a bottleneck of honking cars and frustrated drivers. "Marcus, find us another route. I'm not sitting in this all morning." Marcus Holloway, Dorian's assistant, tapped frantically at his tablet. "There's a side street coming up on the right that should bypass most of this mess, sir." "Then take it." Dorian ordered his driver, not bothering to look up from his phone. "The board meeting starts in 20 minutes, and I want time to review the acquisition papers beforehand." The driver nodded and veered right at the next intersection, accelerating, down a narrower street lined with older buildings. The rain had intensified, forming large puddles along the curbs. Langston had just finished clearing a storm drain when he heard the engines roar. He straightened up, his back protesting after hours of bending, and saw the black SUV approaching, fast, too fast for the wet conditions. Time seemed to slow as the vehicle hit a massive puddle near where Langston stood. The driver had 2 choices: slow down or swerve away from the water. He did neither. The wall of muddy water erupted like a small tsunami, completely drenching Langston from head to toe. The force of it nearly knocked him over, and he had to grab a nearby lamppost to steady himself. Dirty water streamed down his face and soaked through his uniform to his skin. Inside the Escalade, Dorian glanced back through the window and burst into laughter. "Did you see that old man's face?" he hooted, nudging Marcus. "Like a drowned rat." Marcus chuckled nervously, his eyes darting between his boss and the receding figure of the soaked maintenance worker. "Pretty good splash, sir." "Damn right it was," Dorian said, still laughing. "Should have gotten that on video." Back on the corner, Langston slowly wiped the muddy water from his eyes. People passing by averted their gaze, uncomfortable witnesses to his humiliation. A few shot sympathetic looks his way, but no one stopped to help. Langston didn't curse or shake his fist at the departing vehicle. Instead, he calmly removed a handkerchief from his pocket, somehow still dry, and methodically cleaned his face. His expression remained neutral, almost serene, as he wrung out the cloth and returned to his work. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet dignity, a depth of character, that made his silence more powerful than any outburst could have been. Across the street, partially obscured by a large black umbrella, stood a figure watching the entire incident unfold. From the Escalade, Dorian was still chuckling when something made him glance out the window again. That's when he saw the watcher. He couldn't make out the person's face, just the silhouette. Someone tall, motionless, holding an umbrella at an angle that hid their features. But something about the stillness of that figure, the intentional way they seemed to be observing him specifically, sent an unexpected chill down Dorian's spine. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, noticing Dorian's sudden change in demeanor. "Nothing," Dorian muttered, turning away from the window, but the unsettled feeling lingered, like the touch of a cold hand on the back of his neck. What Dorian didn't know was that another set of eyes had captured everything. Jenny Lynn, a college student waiting for the bus, had instinctively pulled out her phone when she saw the SUV speeding toward the puddle. The 10-second clip showed everything: the deliberate acceleration, the massive splash, Langston's dignified response, and even Dorian's laughing face clearly visible through the SUV's window. By noon, the video had been uploaded with a simple caption: "You just messed with the wrong man." Within hours, the clip began gaining traction. Comments poured in. "That was definitely on purpose. Look how he speeds up. Who does that to an old man just doing his job? That's Dorian Blake from Blake Tech. Always knew he was trash." Anyone know who the maintenance worker is? Man's got dignity. The last question sparked particular interest. Somehow, Langston's calm reaction suggested there was more to him than met the eye, and internet sleuths began digging. Langston remained oblivious to his growing online fame as he finished his shift and caught the bus to his modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood across town. The two-room unit was small, but meticulously kept, with bookshelves lining one wall. Philosophy texts by Kant and Aurelius sat alongside military histories and dog-eared paperbacks. On a small side table, framed photographs showed glimpses of another life, a younger Langston in army fatigues, standing tall and proud. Langston shaking hands with a military officer in a formal ceremony. Langston with his arm around another soldier, both of them grinning despite the mud and exhaustion evident on their faces. After a hot shower and change of clothes, Langston made himself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. He ate at his small kitchen table, occasionally glancing at the evening news on a small television in the corner. The splash incident hadn't made it to mainstream media yet. When he finished eating, Langston walked to his bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of an old dresser. Inside lay a wooden box, worn smooth from years of handling. He unlocked it with a key he kept on a chain around his neck. The box contained medals, faded photographs, and an envelope addressed simply, "To T. Merritt." Langston touched the envelope briefly, then closed the box and returned it to its place. That night, as rain continued to fall outside his window, Langston dreamed of jungle heat and helicopter rotors. In the dream, he stood beside a young soldier, both in full combat gear, saluting as a flag-draped coffin was loaded onto a transport plane. "You have to tell them the truth, Lang," a woman's voice whispered from somewhere behind him. "Before it's too late." Langston woke with a start, his heart pounding. The dream felt more like a memory, or perhaps a warning. He sat up in bed, suddenly feeling the weight of secrets long buried. "Not yet," he whispered to the empty room. "Not yet." Kaya Blake scrolled through her phone during her lunch break, a half-eaten salad pushed to the side. Her social media feeds were suddenly filled with a video that had gone viral overnight. She clicked play without much interest, then sat up straight, nearly knocking over her water glass. "Oh my God," she whispered, immediately replaying the clip. There was no mistaking her father's Escalade or his distinctive laugh as the vehicle drenched the elderly street cleaner. But it was the older man who held her attention. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. Kaya, 26 and fiercely independent, had spent years creating distance between herself and her father's world of corporate excess. Where Dorian Blake built his empire on ruthless competition and status symbols, Kaya found meaning in community work and social causes. She studied the old man's face again, then suddenly remembered where she'd seen him before. For the past 2 years, Kaya had volunteered at the Riverside Community Center, teaching art classes to underprivileged kids. Several times, donations of art supplies had appeared with only a note, "For the children." The center director had once pointed out an elderly man walking away after dropping off a box of new sketchbooks. "That's Mr. Rhodes," the director had said. "Never wants recognition, but he's been helping out here for years." Kaya stared at her phone in disbelief. The street cleaner her father had humiliated was the same quiet benefactor who'd been supporting her community work all this time. Across town, Detective Eliza Vaughn was reviewing case files in her office when a colleague mentioned the viral video. "You should see this, Vaughn. Some tech CEO drenching an old guy. Internet's having a field day with it." Vaughn barely glanced up. "I've got actual crimes to solve, Davis. Just watch it. Something about it doesn't sit right." Sighing, Vaughn took the offered phone and pressed play. Her expression remained neutral until the camera zoomed in on the street cleaner's face as he wiped away the muddy water. The phone nearly slipped from her fingers. "You okay?" Davis asked, noticing her sudden pallor. "Fine," she said quickly, handing back the phone. "Who's the maintenance worker? Has anyone identified him?" "Not yet." "Why? You know him?" Vaughn shook her head, but her mind was racing. She waited until Davis left, then pulled open her bottom desk drawer. Inside was a worn manila folder labeled Dustlight, her father's last case before his death 15 years ago. She spread the contents across her desk: newspaper clippings, photocopied military reports, and photographs. Her hands trembled slightly as she found what she was looking for: a faded photo of 5 soldiers standing beside a helicopter. Her father, Colonel James Vaughn, stood in the center. And there on the far left, younger but unmistakable, was the same man from the IC video. "He's alive," she whispered, tracing the face with her fingertip. According to the official record, all members of that unit except her father had died in a classified operation. Her father had died months later in what was ruled a suicide, a ruling she'd never accepted. Meanwhile, Langston continued his daily routine, unaware that his face was becoming the subject of intense speculation online. He swept the same stretch of downtown streets, nodded to the same shop owners, and exchanged pleasantries with the same commuters who bothered to acknowledge him. The children were always his favorite part of the day. They saw him, really saw him, in a way adults rarely did. "Mr. Rhodes," called a little girl, skipping ahead of her hurried mother. "I made this for you." She thrust a crayon drawing into his hands, a stick figure with a broom under a rainbow. "Well now, this is fine artwork, Miss Lily," Langston said, kneeling to her level despite the protest in his knees. "I'll put it right up on my refrigerator." "Lily, we're going to be late," her mother called, offering Langston an apologetic smile. "Sorry, Mr. Rhodes." "No need to apologize," he replied warmly. "A child's greeting is never an interruption." As they walked away, Langston carefully tucked the drawing into his pocket. These small connections, the nods, the drawings, the brief conversations, anchored him to the present when the past threatened to pull him under. That evening, as Langston was finishing his shift, a black sedan pulled up alongside him. The window rolled down to reveal Pastor Clarence Miles, his weathered face serious beneath a worn fedora. "Need a ride, old friend?" the pastor asked, though they both knew this wasn't a casual offer. Langston hesitated, then climbed in. They drove, in silence for several blocks before Pastor Miles spoke again. "I saw the video, Lang," he said quietly. "It's everywhere." "Just a little water, Clarence. Nothing to concern yourself with." "It's not the water I'm worried about. It's the eyes that are suddenly on you." Pastor Miles turned onto a quieter residential street and parked. People are asking questions. Who is this dignified old man? Why does he seem so familiar to some veterans? How does a decorated soldier end up sweeping streets? Langston stared out the window. "Let them ask." Curiosity fades. Not this time, Miles insisted, turning to face his friend. Lang, it's time. They need to know who you are. No. Langston's voice was soft but firm. The past stays buried, Clarence. We agreed. We agreed 20 years ago when the threat was real. Things have changed. The old guard is dying out. Records are being declassified. And now this. He gestured to his phone, where the viral video was paused. This puts you in the spotlight. I'm just an old man with a broom. That's all I want to be. Pastor Miles sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of his friend's jaw. They'll find out eventually. Wouldn't it be better coming from you on your terms? Langston didn't answer. After a moment, he opened the car door. Thanks for the ride, Clarence. Give my best to Martha. Lang. Good night, Clarence. Across town. Kaya stood in the marble foyer of her father's mansion, waiting as the housekeeper announced her unscheduled visit. The place felt cold, despite its opulence. All gleaming surfaces and expensive emptiness. It had been 3 months since she'd last set foot here. Dorian appeared at the top of the curved staircase, surprise quickly masked by his usual confident smirk. Well, this is unexpected. To what do I owe the pleasure, daughter? Kaya held up her phone, displaying the frozen image of the splash. Care to explain this? Dorian descended the stairs with deliberate casualness. A little rainwater, hardly newsworthy. You deliberately soaked an elderly man who was just doing his job, and then you laughed about it. Her voice remained steady, though her hands shook slightly. Do you even know who that man is? Some maintenance worker, Dorian said dismissively, pouring himself a scotch from the bar cart. Want a drink? His name is Langston Rhodes. He volunteers at the community center where I teach art classes. How touching, Dorian mocked, taking a sip of his drink. Are you really this worked up over a little splash? The city probably pays him to get wet. Kaya stared at her father, trying to reconcile the man before her with the dad who had once carried her on his shoulders at the zoo. You know what's sad? You could buy and sell half the city, but that old man has more dignity in his little finger than you've shown in your entire life. Dorian's expression hardened. If you came here just to lecture me about some street sweeper, I came here because I hoped, there might be a shred of remorse, some recognition that what you did was cruel and petty. She shook her head. I was wrong. As she turned to leave, Dorian called after her. He's just a nobody, Kaya. You're getting worked up over nothing. Kaya paused at the door. That's where you're wrong, Dad. He's definitely somebody. I just don't think you're going to like finding out who. After leaving her father's mansion, Kaya drove to the public library. Something about Langston Rhodes nagged at her. The quiet dignity, the way he carried himself, the glimpses of intelligence and education that seemed at odds with his humble job. In the library's community archives section, she requested access to local history files, specifically focusing on community leaders and veterans organizations from the previous decades. The archivist, intrigued by her request, brought out several boxes of photographs and news clippings. Hours later, as the library was about to close, Kaya found what she was looking for. A yellowed newspaper photo from 30 years ago. A younger Langston Rhodes, wearing a decorated military uniform, stood shaking hands with Senator William Marshall at a veterans recognition ceremony. The caption read, Captain Langston Rhodes receives commendation for distinguished service. Meanwhile, Dorian Blake sat in his home office, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in his stomach. The mysterious watcher from the street corner haunted him, as did his daughter's parting words. He told himself it was ridiculous to be concerned about a viral video or an old street cleaner. He'd weathered far worse PR storms before. His phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. The screen showed unknown caller. Blake, he answered curtly. Silence greeted him, then a soft click as something was slid under his office door. The call disconnected. Frowning, Dorian crossed the room and picked up a manila envelope from the floor. Inside was a single photograph, old, slightly faded. It showed 2 men. One was clearly Dorian's father, Robert Blake, in his prime as a defense contractor. The other was a younger version of the street cleaner, both in military dress uniforms, standing before an American flag. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink were the words, "You think the past is dead?" Dorian's hands trembled as he stared at the photo. His father had died 10 years ago, taking many secrets to his grave. But perhaps not all of them had stayed buried. At the same time, in a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city, Langston knelt before a simple headstone. The name Tyrone Merritt was carved into the granite, along with dates marking a life cut short at 35 years. "It's starting again, Ty," Langston whispered, placing a single riverstone atop the marker. "All these years of quiet, and now this." He shook his head, a sad smile crossing his face. Funny how life works. One splash of mud, and the past comes rushing back. He sat in silence for a long moment, the evening breeze rustling through nearby trees. Finally he stood, his knees protesting. "I hope you stayed hidden, brother," he said softly, "because I think the storm is coming back for us all." As Langston walked away, the setting sun cast long shadows across the cemetery. The grave he left behind held no body, just secrets and silence, preserved like specimens in amber, waiting for the light of truth to set them free. The night air carried a chill as Langston Rhodes made his way home from the bus stop. The viral video had been circulating for 3 days now, and he'd noticed the whispers, the sidelong glances from people who normally wouldn't give him a second look. Fame, even this small taste of it, felt like an ill-fitting coat on his shoulders. When he turned onto his street, instinct made him pause. 20 years of training didn't fade, even after decades of civilian life. Something was different. The shadows weren't quite right. He approached his apartment building cautiously, eyes scanning the parked cars and darkened doorways. Nothing seemed overtly suspicious, but the feeling persisted. As he climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, Langston noticed a small mark near his doorframe. A simple chalk symbol, 3 lines intersecting to form what might look like an asterisk to most people. To Langston, it was something else entirely, a signal he hadn't seen in 20 years. "Ghost," he whispered, his fingers hovering over the mark without touching it. Inside his apartment, Langston went through his nightly routine with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere. The chalk mark wasn't a coincidence. It was a message and a warning. He brewed a pot of coffee, knowing sleep would be impossible now. As the clock ticked past midnight, he sat in darkness by his window, watching the street below. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective under the streetlights. At 1:17 a.m., a figure emerged from the shadows across the street. Tall and lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to not being seen. Langston watched as the man crossed the street and disappeared into the entrance of his building. Langston didn't reach for a weapon. He'd given those up long ago. Instead, he simply waited, listening to the familiar creak of the stairs, the soft footfalls approaching his door. 3 quiet knocks, then silence. Langston opened the door to find a man in his 60s, dark skin weathered by years and miles, a gray beard framing a face that still carried the sharp alertness of a predator. The years had changed him, but there was no mistaking those eyes. "Still sweeping, old man?" the visitor asked, his voice a low rumble tinged with amusement. "Still hiding in shadows?" Langston replied, stepping aside to let him in. Tyrone Merritt, known as Ghost during their service years, entered the apartment, his eyes instantly cataloging exits and defensive positions from decades of habit. He wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a black jacket, worn boots. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would leave an impression in someone's memory. "Coffee?" Langston offered, closing and locking the door. Ghost nodded, removing his jacket to reveal arms corded with lean muscle. "Black. Some things don't change." They sat at Langston's small kitchen table, the silence between them weighted with unspoken history. Neither rushed to break it. They'd both learned the value of patience long ago. Finally, Ghost spoke. "Saw you on the internet. Getting famous in your old age." "Not by choice," Langston replied, warming his hands around his mug. They know you're alive, Lang. Ghost's expression was grave. If you think that mud was a coincidence, think again. Langston's eyes narrowed. Blake's son? He's just a spoiled rich kid with poor manners. A spoiled rich kid whose father was neck deep in dustlight, Ghost countered. And now you're all over social media. Face recognition software isn't what it was 20 years ago. People are already connecting dots. Let them connect, Langston said, though his voice lacked conviction. The official records show Langston Rhodes died in that jungle. The man who sweeps streets is just a retiree who happens to look like a dead soldier. Ghost leaned forward. Vaughn's daughter is a detective now. She's reopened her father's case files. That got Langston's attention. James's girl? She was just a teenager when he died. She's been digging for 15 years, and now she's got a fresh lead. You. Langston closed his eyes briefly, memories flooding back. Colonel James Vaughn had been the only commanding officer who'd believed them, who'd tried to help expose the truth. His suicide had been the final warning that had sent Langston and Ghost underground. What about you? Langston asked. If they're looking for me, they'll be looking for you too. Ghost's lips curled in a humorless smile. Let them try. I didn't earn my name for nothing. Across town, in her downtown loft apartment, Kaya Blake sat surrounded by printouts and open browser tabs. What had started as simple curiosity about the man her father had humiliated had evolved into a full-blown investigation. The photograph from the library archives had been just the beginning. Once she knew Captain Langston Rhodes had existed, finding more information became easier, though the trail went mysteriously cold about 20 years ago. Her phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. Hello? She answered cautiously. Ms. Blake? My name is Sam Reynolds, retired journalist with the Chronicle. You left a message about Captain Rhodes? Kaya straightened. Yes, thank you for calling back. I found a photograph of him receiving a commendation, but I can't find much else. It's like he disappeared. A heavy pause. There's a reason for that. Look, I don't discuss this over the phone. If you're serious about learning more, meet me at the Wilson Public Library tomorrow at Known History section, back tables. Before she could ask more questions, he hung up. The next day, Kaya arrived at the library 15 minutes early, nervously scanning the history section. An elderly white man with thick glasses and a tweed jacket sat at a corner table, a stack of old newspapers beside him. Mr. Reynolds? She approached cautiously. He nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. You're Robert Blake's granddaughter. It wasn't a question. Kaya sat down, surprised. You knew my grandfather? Knew of him, Reynolds clarified, his expression unreadable. Defense contractor, powerful connections, died about 10 years ago. And you're Dorian's daughter, though you don't advertise the connection. I'm my own person, Kaya said firmly. Reynolds studied her for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. The man you're asking about, Captain Rhodes, vanished after testifying against Project GOLIH, a classified military operation. His testimony was sealed, but the rumors were that he exposed corruption at the highest levels of military and civilian defense. GOLIH, Kaya repeated. Government-operated logistical intelligence and tactical heightened awareness, Reynolds recited. Fancy name for a dirty program. Testing experimental combat drugs on soldiers without consent. Targeting the poorest units with the highest percentage of minority servicemen. He slid an old newspaper across the table. The headline read, Military Whistleblower Allegations Sealed by Court Order. The official story was that Rhodes died in a training accident shortly after, Reynolds continued. But some of us never believed it. The timing was too convenient. And you think the street cleaner is the same man? Kaya asked. Reynolds shrugged. I'm just giving you context, Ms. Blake. What you do with it is your business. But I will say this. If that street cleaner is who I think he is, he didn't vanish to avoid publicity. He vanished because powerful people wanted him silent. Permanently. People like my grandfather? Kaya asked quietly. Reynolds gathered his papers. I've said all I'm comfortable saying. Be careful, Ms. Blake. Some stones are better left unturned, especially when family reputations are built on what lies beneath them. That evening, Pastor Clarence Miles sat in his church office long after the day's final meeting had ended. The weight of decades of secrets pressed heavily on his shoulders as he unlocked the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet and removed a false bottom. Inside lay a folder containing papers yellowed with age, birth certificates, death certificates, and social security cards. Some bore the official stamps of government offices. Others were masterful forgeries created by a man known only as the Clerk, a document forger who'd specialized in helping Vietnam veterans disappear. Pastor Miles had used those connections, again 20 years ago, when two desperate soldiers showed up at his door in the middle of the night, one of them bleeding from a bullet wound that had missed everything important according to the other. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He quickly returned the documents to their hiding place before calling, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Langston, looking more tired than usual. "Ghost is back," Langston said without preamble. Pastor Miles sank back in his chair. "Lord have mercy. When?" "Last night. He says it's starting again, Clarence. People connecting dots, asking questions." "I've been feeling it too," the pastor admitted. "Had a visit from a young woman asking about veteran support groups from 20 years ago. Said she was doing research for a community project, but her eyes were too sharp, her questions too specific." "Blake's daughter?" Langston nodded. "She volunteers at that community center I donate to sometimes." "That puts her closer to you than is comfortable," Pastor Miles observed. "What does Ghost say?" "That we should run. Disappear again." Langston shook his head. "I'm too old for that, Clarence. Too tired." Pastor Miles regarded his old friend with sadness. "It was the only way to keep you from being hunted, Lang. Those death certificates, those new identities. It was the only way." "I know," Langston said, softly. "And I thank you for it. But I've been living half a life for 20 years. Maybe it's time for the truth." "The truth could still get you killed," Pastor Miles warned. Langston's smile held no humor. "We all die, Clarence. The question is whether we've truly lived first." At Blake Tech headquarters, Dorian Blake was in the middle of a board meeting when his assistant slipped him a note. "Urgent call from Marston Holdings. Please call back immediately." Dorian excused himself, stepping into his private office to, return the call. "Blake here," he answered tersely. "Mr. Blake, this is Thomas Marston. I'll be direct. In light of recent publicity, our firm is reconsidering our investment position with Blake Tech." Dorian felt his stomach drop. Marston Holdings was their largest investor, with nearly $300 million in Blake Tech stock. "Surely you're not referring to a trivial video that's already old news," Dorian said, forcing confidence into his voice. "The video was merely the catalyst, Mr. Blake. Our due diligence team has uncovered some concerning connections between your father's defense contracts and several highly problematic military programs. We cannot afford even the appearance of association with such matters." "Those contracts were 20 years ago and my father is dead," Dorian snapped. "Indeed. But the past has a way of resurfacing, doesn't it? We'll be liquidating our position over the next week. I suggest you prepare your board accordingly." The line went dead, leaving Dorian staring at his phone in disbelief. Within seconds, it rang again. His PR director, reporting that 3 major news outlets had requested comments about historical connections between Blake Tech and military testing scandals. By the time Dorian returned to the boardroom, his face was ashen. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a barely contained fury that made his employees shrink back in their seats. "Meeting adjourned," he barked. "Jenkins, Williams, Marshall, my office. Now." As the room cleared, Dorian pulled up the viral video on his tablet, studying the old man's face with new intensity. Who was this street cleaner, and why did he suddenly feel like the harbinger of Dorian's downfall? Detective Eliza Vaughn sat in her car outside Langston Rhodes' apartment building, debating her next move. 20 years of questions, of doubting. The official story of her father's suicide had led her to this moment. The file on her passenger seat contained everything she'd pieced together about Operation Dustlight, much of it from her father's hidden notes, discovered behind a loose brick in their basement years after his death. The official investigation had ruled his death a suicide, brought on by PTSD and depression. But the hidden notes told a different story. A whistleblower case, threats, surveillance, and finally, a name scratched in her father's handwriting. Find Rhodes. Taking a deep breath, Vaughn got out of her car and approached the building. She was halfway up the exterior stairs when she noticed a man exiting, tall, bearded, moving with a quiet grace that immediately put her on alert. Their eyes met briefly, and something in his gaze, recognition perhaps, made her freeze. Then he was gone, disappearing around the corner with practiced ease. Vaughn continued up to Langston's door and knocked firmly. When Langston opened the door, he showed no surprise at finding a stranger there. His eyes, however, took in her stance, the slight bulge of a service weapon under her jacket. "Detective," he said simply. "How did you know?" Vaughn asked, surprised. A faint smile crossed Langston's weathered face. "You stand like your father." Those 5 words confirmed everything. Vaughn felt her heart race. "Then you knew him. Colonel James Vaughn." "May I see some identification, Detective?" Langston asked calmly. She showed him her badge. "Detective Eliza Vaughn, Major Crimes." Langston studied it, then stepped back, opening his door wider. "I think you'd better come in, Detective Vaughn. We have a lot to discuss." As the door closed behind them, neither noticed the sleek black car parked across the street, nor the telephoto, lens capturing their interaction. The night had deepened by the time Langston finished speaking. Detective Vaughn sat across from him, her notebook filled with 20 years of answers she'd been seeking. "So my father wasn't paranoid," she said finally. "They really were after him, after all of you. Your father was a good man, Detective, one of the few who believed us when we came forward about the drug trials." Langston's eyes held a distant pain. They targeted the units with the highest percentage of Black and Latino soldiers. Experimental combat enhancers, stimulants that kept men fighting for days with no sleep, drugs that dampened fear response. Half my platoon came home with heart problems, psychosis, addiction. And Dorian Blake's father was supplying these drugs? Langston nodded. Robert Blake's company manufactured them. When things went sideways and soldiers started dying from side effects, he helped orchestrate the cover-up. Your father was building a case, not just against the military brass, but against Blake and his civilian partners. And you, Vaughn said slowly. You and this ghost. You were his key witnesses. Until they got to him first, Langston confirmed. After your father died, Ghost and I knew we were next. Pastor Miles helped us disappear. New identities, new lives. Fake deaths, Vaughn added. The dead can't testify, Langston said simply. And the dead aren't hunted. Vaughn's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, then looked up sharply. The street where my father's car went off the road. They're reopening that section for construction. The work crew found something. Embedded in the hillside. Metal fragments they think came from another vehicle. Langston's expression darkened. Your father didn't drive off that road by accident or choice, Detective. We always knew that. I need your testimony, Vaughn said, leaning forward intently. Both you and this ghost. With what I have now, plus your eyewitness accounts of the threats, the cover-up, Ghost won't testify, Langston interrupted. And even if he did, it would be our word against a system designed to protect itself. We need hard evidence. The original files your father was compiling. Those disappeared after his death, Vaughn said, frustration evident in her voice. Langston was quiet for a moment. Perhaps not all of them. Before he could elaborate, a sharp knock at the door made them both tense. Expecting someone? Vaughn asked, hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. No, Langston said, moving cautiously to the door. Who is it? It's Kaya Blake, came the reply. I need to talk to you, Mr. Rhodes. It's important. Langston exchanged a glance with Vaughn, who nodded slightly. He opened the door to find Dorian Blake's daughter standing there, her expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. Ms. Blake, Langston greeted her calmly. This is an unexpected visit. I know who you are, Kaya said without preamble. Captain Langston Rhodes, formerly of the 142nd Special Tactics Unit. And I think I know why my father's company is suddenly facing investor pullouts and media inquiries about military drug trials from 20 years ago. Langston regarded her for a long moment, then stepped aside. You'd better come in as well. There's someone you should meet. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. Kaya listened, increasingly horrified as Langston and Detective Vaughn laid out the tangled history of Project Goliath, the experimental trials, the deaths and cover-ups, and the central role her grandfather had played in it all. I knew Grandpa was ruthless in business, she said finally, her voice hollow. But this, experimenting on soldiers, covering up deaths. Your grandfather saw soldiers as resources to be optimized, Langston said, his tone remarkably free of bitterness. Not as people with lives and families. And my father? Kaya asked, dreading the answer. Was he involved? Dorian was young when it happened, Langston said. But he knew, and he benefited from the fortune his father built on those contracts. There's something else you should know, Langston continued after a pause. Your father and I have met before, long before that splash in the street. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Langston told a story he hadn't shared in decades. A jungle ambush in a classified operation, a young lieutenant, Dorian Blake, separated from his unit, surrounded by enemy forces, and a Captain Rhodes who led a rescue mission against direct orders, saving the young man and his squad at great personal risk. My father never mentioned any of this, Kaya said, stunned. I doubt he even remembers, Langston replied. He was barely conscious when we extracted him, and later, when the Goliath scandal broke, Robert Blake would have made sure his son didn't connect the dots between the captain who saved him and the whistleblower threatening the family business. So all these years, Kaya said slowly, you've been invisible, sweeping the streets, knowing what my family did to you and your men. Life gives us strange paths to walk, Langston said simply. I made my peace with mine. The room fell silent, as Kaya processed everything she'd learned. Finally, she pulled out her phone. I need to record this, all of it. People need to know the truth. Langston hesitated, decades of caution warring with the need for truth. I understand if you're not ready, Kaya said softly. But I want you to know that I'll help however I can. What my family did was wrong, deeply wrong. Something in her sincerity made Langston nod. Ask your questions, Ms. Blake. It's time this story was told. As Kaya began recording, none of them noticed the red dot of a listening device blinking silently on the underside of Langston's kitchen table, placed there hours earlier by a figure who had entered the apartment building just before Langston returned home. Across town in his penthouse office, Dorian Blake listened to the conversation in real time, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. The glass of scotch in his hand shattered as he heard his daughter pledge to help the man he'd humiliated, the man who, apparently, had once saved his life. Sir, his security chief said urgently, we've got a situation. Marcus isn't answering. His phone and his wife says he never came home last night. Marcus Holloway, Dorian's assistant who had been in the SUV during the splash incident, had been tasked with gathering information on Langston Rhodes. His disappearance now in the middle of this emerging crisis sent alarm bells ringing. Find him, Dorian ordered. Use the GPS on his company phone. 2 hours later, police responded to a call from a cleaning lady who had discovered Marcus Holloway's body in his downtown apartment. Initial reports indicated suicide, a gunshot wound to the head, a handwritten note apologizing for unnamed sins. But when Detective Vaughn arrived at the scene, her experienced eye caught details others might miss. The angle of the wound, slightly off for a self-inflicted shot. The handwriting on the note, shaky in a way that suggested duress rather than despair. And most tellingly, a message carved into the underside of his desk drawer with what appeared to be a key. He buried the files. As the medical examiner processed the scene, Vaughn stepped outside to make a call. The assistant is dead, she said, without preamble when Langston answered. Staged to look like suicide. History repeats, Langston replied grimly. They're cleaning house. You need to be careful, Detective. What about you? If they're eliminating connections, I've survived 20 years by being invisible, Langston reminded her. But there's something else. The message carved into the desk. He buried the files. Could that refer to your father's missing evidence? Possibly, Vaughn said, her mind racing. But where? We searched everywhere after his death. Not everywhere, Langston said. There's one place no one would have thought to look. That evening, as twilight settled over the city, Langston made his way to the small cemetery, where Tyrone Merritt's empty grave stood as a monument to a life that hadn't ended. The marker next to it bore the name of another soldier from their unit, David Carter, whose body had never been recovered from the jungle operation that went wrong. But unlike Merritt's grave, Carter's wasn't empty. He'd been buried with full military honors, his casket closed due to the condition of his remains. What the military didn't know was that the sealed casket contained more than a fallen soldier's body. It also held a waterproof case with duplicates of every file, every photograph, every piece of evidence Colonel Vaughn had collected before his death. Langston stood before the grave, memories washing over him like a tide. He'd carried many burdens, over the years, but few weighed as heavily as his role in Carter's death, and in the years of silence that followed. I'm sorry, David, he said softly. I should have spoken sooner. Should have made sure they all paid for what they did to you, to all of us. A twig snapped behind him, and Langston turned to find Ghost emerging from the shadows, his expression somber. Talking to the dead won't bring them justice, Lang, Ghost said, approaching to stand beside him at the grave. But this might. He held up a small key, identical to the one Langston wore around his neck. You kept it all these years, Langston observed. Ghost nodded. Always thought we might need it someday. Looks like that day has come. As they stood in the gathering darkness, discussing how to proceed with the buried evidence, neither noticed. The sleek drone hovering silently above the treetops, its camera zooming in on their faces, transmitting real-time footage to a luxurious office across town. Elliot Voss, billionaire, philanthropist, and man of carefully cultivated mystery, watched the feed with intense interest. Unlike Dorian Blake, who had inherited wealth and connections, Voss had built his fortune from nothing, and unlike the Blakes who used their power to protect themselves, Voss had spent years quietly building a network dedicated to exposing corruption and bringing justice to those long ignored by the system. So it's true, he murmured, enlarging the image of Langston and Ghost. The ghosts of Operation Dustlight have returned. His assistant, standing quietly nearby, raised an eyebrow. Should I make contact? Voss considered for a moment, then nodded. Reach out to the daughter, Kaya Blake. She's our best entry point. She's already recording their testimony. And Blake's company? A cold smile crossed Voss's face. Begin the process. By this time tomorrow, I want every investor, board member, and business partner questioning their association with Blake Tech. As night fully descended on the city, 4 separate players were making moves in a game that had begun 20 years earlier. Langston and Ghost, preparing to unearth evidence long buried. Detective Vaughn, connecting the dots between her father's death and the current crisis. Dorian Blake, desperately trying to contain a scandal that threatened everything he'd built. And Elliot Voss, the unseen catalyst accelerating events toward an inevitable collision. And at the center of it all was a simple street cleaner, a man who had spent decades in the shadows, who had suffered the indignity of muddy water splashed across his uniform, and whose quiet dignity had finally cracked open the door to long-delayed justice. In his modest apartment, Langston sat alone after Ghost departed, staring at the old wooden box that contained his past. The metals inside had lost their shine, the photographs had faded, but the truth they represented remained as sharp and clear as the day he'd testified against Project Geolai AT. He removed the letter addressed to T. Merritt, a letter he'd written years ago but never delivered, explaining his choice to stay silent, to live half a life rather than risk more bloodshed. Reading it now, the words seemed to belong to another man, a younger, more fearful version of himself. If I speak, others die, he had written. But if I stay silent, they win again. Langston folded the letter and placed it back in the box. The choice that had paralyzed him for 20 years suddenly seemed clear. Sometimes justice required risk. Sometimes truth demanded courage. And sometimes a simple splash of mud could wash away decades of careful invisibility, forcing a man to finally stand in the light, whatever the cost might be. The studio lights were uncomfortably warm as Langston Rhodes sat across from Catherine Westfield, one of the nation's most respected documentary journalists. Her production team had transformed a small conference room at the Bridgeport Hotel into a makeshift studio, ensuring privacy while they recorded what was quickly becoming the most anticipated interview of the year. "Are you ready, Captain Rhodes?" Catherine asked, her voice gentle but firm. Langston nodded, his hands resting calmly on his knees. At the edge of the room, Elliot Voss stood watching, his tall frame almost blending into the shadows. Their first meeting, arranged through Kaya, had been brief but intense, Voss laying out exactly how he could help bring the Geolia Tate story to light, with resources and protection that Langston had never imagined possible. "Recording in 3, 2, 1, the cameraman signaled, and Catherine's expression shifted subtly into her professional persona. "Today I'm speaking with Captain Langston Rhodes, a decorated military officer whose name may not be familiar to most Americans, but whose story touches on a decades-old scandal that reaches the highest levels of our military and government. Captain Rhodes, thank you for breaking your silence after all these years." Langston's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man unburdening himself after decades of restraint. "Some truths can't stay buried forever, Ms. Westfield, no matter how deep you dig the grave." For the next 2 hours, Langston walked through the basics of Project Geolia Tate, the experimental combat drugs, the targeting of units with high percentages of minority soldiers, the deadly side effects, and the systematic cover-up that followed. He avoided naming specific individuals, focusing instead on the institutional failures and the suffering of the soldiers used as unwitting test subjects. "My unit lost 17 men," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Not to enemy fire, but to heart failure, psychosis, and suicide in the months after they were given these drugs. Men who survived firefights and ambushes, only to die in their beds or by their own hands because of what was done to them." "And when you tried to report this," Catherine prompted, "the files disappeared. Witnesses were transferred or discharged. Medical records were altered." Langston leaned forward slightly, "and those who couldn't be silenced through bureaucratic means faced more direct threats." As the interview concluded, Catherine asked the question that had been circulating online for weeks. The video that recently went viral, a wealthy executive, deliberately splashing you with muddy water. Was that connected to your past? A ghost of a smile crossed Langston's face. "Life has a strange way of bringing things full circle, Ms. Westfield. Sometimes a splash of mud can wash away years of careful invisibility." Within hours of the interview being posted online, social media erupted. Veterans groups organized virtual and physical rallies in support of Captain Rhodes and the Geolia Tate victims. Military forums filled with retired soldiers sharing stories of similar experiments they'd witnessed or experienced. News networks ran special segments analyzing the implications of Langston's allegations. The hashtag #Justice for Rhodes began trending nationally. In his office at Blake Tech headquarters, Dorian Blake watched the growing storm with mounting horror. His PR team had been working around the clock, but the narrative was slipping completely out of their control. 3 major clients had already suspended their contracts pending ethical reviews, and the company's stock had dropped 18% in 2 days. "This ends now," Dorian snarled, slamming his laptop closed. "Set up a press conference for tomorrow morning. It's time I addressed this nonsense directly." The next morning, Dorian stood before a forest of microphones in Blake Tech's sleek lobby, projecting confidence he no longer felt. Cameras flashed as he straightened his tie and began speaking. "I want to address the allegations being made by Langston Rhodes, a former military officer who has recently resurfaced with claims about military testing programs from over 20 years ago." Dorian's voice was smooth, rehearsed. "While I sympathize with Mr. Rhodes's apparent difficulties, I must categorically reject any implication that Blake Tech or my family had involvement in any improper military contracting. He continued, his tone becoming dismissive. Mr. Rhodes appears to be a troubled individual who has spent decades living on society's margins. His recollections, while perhaps sincere, are the products of a delusional mind, not historical fact. A reporter interrupted. Mr. Blake, what about the viral video showing you deliberately splashing Mr. Rhodes with your vehicle? Dorian's expression tightened. An unfortunate traffic incident that has been grossly mischaracterized online. I've apologized privately for any distress caused. As he spoke, the large screens behind him, meant to display Blake Tech's latest innovations, suddenly switched to a split-screen image. On one side, the viral splashing video. On the other, a military photograph of a younger Langston in full dress uniform receiving a Silver Star for valor. Gasps and murmurs spread through the assembled press as Dorian turned, seeing the images for the first time. His face drained of color as he realized his carefully orchestrated damage control was unraveling in real time. Mr. Blake, another reporter, called out, "Is it true that Captain Rhodes once saved your life during a classified military operation in Southeast Asia?" The question hit Dorian like a physical blow. Fragmented memories he'd long suppressed suddenly surged forward. Jungle heat, the copper smell of blood, a firm voice commanding him to stay conscious as strong arms carried him to safety. "This press conference is over," he stammered, backing away from the podium as reporters shouted more questions. His security team rushed to form a protective barrier around him as he retreated toward the elevators. By that afternoon, a new bombshell hit the news. Tyrone Ghost Merritt, long presumed dead, appeared at a veterans rally in Washington, D.C. His imposing figure took the stage to thunderous applause from former servicemen and women. "For 20 years I've been a ghost," he began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. "A dead man walking because telling the truth was a death sentence. Today, that changes." With methodical precision, Ghost outlined his role in Operation Dustlight, the classified mission where everything went wrong. He displayed scars from wounds that should have been fatal, explaining how he and Langston had survived only to discover the operation had been compromised from within, sacrificed to test the combat effectiveness of the Geoliatage drugs. "Under extreme conditions, they left us to die," Ghost said, his voice hardening. 15 men went in, 4 came out, and when we tried to expose the truth, they came after us again. This time with paperwork instead of bullets. He held up a death certificate bearing his name. "According to official records, I died 20 years ago. A convenient fiction for those who wanted me silenced." The crowd fell silent as Ghost looked directly into the cameras. "I'm speaking now. To those who ordered Operation Dustlight, who approved Project Geoliatage, who covered up the deaths of good soldiers to protect profits and promotions. Your time is up, your secrets are coming to light, and no amount of money or power will protect you from the truth." Meanwhile, Detective Vaughn was making moves of her own. Armed with new evidence connecting Marcus Holloway's death to the Geoliatage cover-up, she obtained a warrant to arrest retired General Harold Weathers, the military officer who had pressured her father years ago to drop his investigation. The arrest was captured by news cameras as the aging general was led from his suburban home in handcuffs. Initial questioning revealed a man desperate to protect himself, offering to provide names and documents in exchange for leniency. Blake's people were behind it all, he was reported to have told investigators. They supplied the drugs, falsified the test results, and orchestrated the cover-up when things went sideways. As these events unfolded, Langston's health began to falter. Years of suppressed stress, combined with the intensity of the past weeks, finally caught up with him. During a meeting with Kaya and Detective Vaughn, he collapsed, clutching his chest. The Boo ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and urgent voices. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed extreme exhaustion complicated by an irregular heartbeat, possibly a long-term side effect of his own brief exposure to the Geoliatage compounds decades earlier. Kaya refused to leave his side, keeping vigil in a chair beside his hospital bed. She watched his chest rise and fall, this man who had once saved her father, who had endured decades of silence and obscurity, who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power, even at the cost of his health. When Langston opened his eyes the next morning, Kaya was still there, her laptop open as she worked on something intently. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice raspy. Kaya looked up, relief washing over her face. "Says the man who just scared 10 years off my life." She moved to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been run over by the past," Langston replied with a weak smile. "The doctors say you need rest," Kaya told him, "but there's something you should see first." She turned her laptop toward him, showing a live stream video of herself that had garnered over 2 million views overnight. On screen, Kaya stood on the steps of Blake Tech headquarters, her expression resolute as she addressed a crowd of reporters. "My name is Kaya Blake. I am the daughter of Dorian Blake and the granddaughter of Robert Blake. I stand before you today to publicly break ties with my father and the company that bears our name." Her voice was strong, unwavering. "The man my father humiliated, the man whose dignity moved millions online. That man once saved my father's life in combat. Captain Langston Rhodes risked everything to rescue Dorian Blake during Operation Dustlight, only to be betrayed when he later exposed the truth about Project Geoliatech." The Kaya beside Langston's hospital bed watched his face as he viewed the video. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she said quietly. Langston reached for her hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You've sacrificed much for the truth." "Nothing compared to what you sacrificed," she replied. Outside the hospital, reporters and supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Stand with Rhodes," and "Justice for Geoliatech victims." The story had captured the nation's attention, transforming from a viral video of casual cruelty into a referendum on military accountability and corporate ethics. In his private office, Elliot Voss watched the unfolding events with satisfaction. The campaign was proceeding even better than he'd anticipated. But when his assistant entered with a report on Langston's health concerns, Voss's expression darkened. "We need him strong enough to testify," Voss said, his tone revealing an edge of calculation beneath his philanthropic exterior. "Arrange for specialists whatever he needs. I didn't spend years tracking down these Geoliatech connections to have our star witness falter now." "Sir?" his assistant ventured cautiously. "About your brother. My brother died because of men like Robert Blake," Voss cut in, his voice suddenly cold. "Men who saw soldiers as lab rats. This isn't just about justice anymore, it's about making an example of Blake Tech and everyone connected to it." The assistant nodded, recognizing the dangerous glint in his employer's eye. Voss had built his public image around justice and transparency, but those closest to him knew his motivations ran deeper and darker than his carefully cultivated persona suggested. That evening, Ghost slipped into Langston's hospital room after visiting hours, moving past security with the ease of a man accustomed to being invisible. "You look like hell," he greeted his old friend. "Good to see you too," Langston replied with a weak chuckle. Ghost settled into the chair Kaya had vacated. "Blake's daughter seems committed to the cause." "She is," Langston confirmed. "She's recording everything, building a comprehensive account." Ghost nodded, then leaned closer. "What about Voss? You trust him?" Langston considered the question. "He has resources we need, connections we don't have." "He also has an agenda," Ghost countered. "I did some digging. His brother was in the 75th Infantry, deployed to the same region where Operation Dustlight went down. Died under classified circumstances around the same time." Langston absorbed this information silently. Finally, he said, "You think he's using us?" "I think," Ghost replied carefully, "that you've gone from being their enemy to being their symbol. And symbols are easy to use and discard." The weight of Ghost's warning hung between them as night settled over the hospital. Outside, supporters maintained their vigil, unaware of the competing agendas swirling around the man they'd come to champion, a man who had only ever wanted to sweep his corner of the world clean. From his hospital bed, Langston made a decision. He asked Kaya to bring him a laptop and, over the next several hours, composed a detailed confession letter. the same letter he should have made public 20 years earlier. In it, he named names, detailed events, and explained his own role, both as a rescuer and as a man who had ultimately chosen silence over continued resistance. When he finished, he handed the document to Kaya. "If anything happens to me," he told her, "make sure this reaches the right people." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Kaya insisted, but she took the file nonetheless, recognizing the steel in Langston's eyes, the look of a man preparing for battle one final time. The morning dawned with a sound that sent Dorian Blake bolt upright in bed, the rhythmic pounding of a battering ram against his front door. Within moments, his bedroom filled with federal agents in tactical gear, weapons drawn, shouting orders as they secured the premises. "Dorian Blake," announced a stern-faced agent. "We have a warrant to search these premises for evidence relating to Project Geoliatage, Operation Dustlight, and the death of Marcus Holloway." Still in his silk pajamas, Dorian was escorted to his living room, where he watched in stunned silence as agents methodically moved through his mansion, seizing computers, files, and storage devices. Outside, news helicopters circled, capturing footage of the raid that would dominate the day's headlines. "My lawyers will have your badges," Dorian threatened weakly. The lead agent merely handed him a copy of the warrant. "Your lawyers are welcome to contest this in court, Mr. Blake. In the meantime, we have probable cause linking you to obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy related to your assistant's death." Across town, Detective Vaughn and Ghost had followed the clue from Marcus Holloway's desk. He buried the files to a storage facility registered to a shell company connected to Blake Tech. Inside a climate-controlled unit, they discovered a digital treasure trove, a hard drive containing video recordings of private military meetings dating back 20 years. In one particularly damning video, Robert Blake sat at a conference table with several high-ranking military officers, discussing casualty reports from the Geoliatage trials with disturbing casualness. 17% fatality is within acceptable parameters, Robert Blake said on the recording, swirling his scotch. The enhanced combat effectiveness in the surviving subjects more than justifies the investment. "And the whistleblowers?" asked a general whose face was just out of frame. Robert Blake laughed, the sound chilling even through the grainy footage. "Leave those loose ends to me. My son's unit just encountered some unexpected resistance in their current operation." Tragic. Losses are common in those conditions. The video confirmed what Langston and Ghost had suspected for decades. Operation Dustlight hadn't been compromised by enemy forces. It had been deliberately set up to fail, a live fire test of the Geoliatage compounds with expendable soldiers as unwitting test subjects. As Detective Vaughn secured the hard drive as evidence, Ghost stood motionless, his expression unreadable. "All these years," he finally said, "I thought we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." "You were targeted," Vaughn confirmed grimly, "and my father died trying to expose it." In his hospital room, Langston received news of these developments with quiet vindication. Kaya had brought her recording equipment, documenting his reactions and additional memories triggered by the discoveries. "I remember your grandfather," Langston told her during one session, his voice distant with recollection. "He visited our base once before Operation Dustlight, walked through our barracks like he was inspecting livestock." "Tell me about my father," Kaya prompted gently, "about when you saved him." Langston closed his eyes briefly. He was young, scared. His unit was pinned down after the operation went wrong. Most of his men were wounded or dead. When we found him, he was feverish from a leg wound, barely conscious. "Did you He thank you." A sad smile crossed Langston's face. He never knew who pulled him out. By the time he regained full consciousness, he was already in a medical transport headed home. And later, when the Geoliatage scandal broke, I became just another name on a list of troublemakers threatening the family business. "He owes you his life," Kaya said, her voice catching. "We all owe debts we never acknowledge," Langston replied. "Your father lived under the shadow of a ruthless man who taught him that power matters more than people, that wealth justifies any action. Perhaps he never had the chance to become anyone else." Kaya's documentary was taking shape. A powerful narrative blending Langston's testimony, Ghost's experiences, and the mounting evidence of corporate military corruption. When the first segment aired on a major news network, it broke viewing records for its time slot. Meanwhile, the Senate Judiciary Committee announced emergency hearings on Project Goliath, with Langston scheduled as the lead witness once doctors cleared him to travel. The invitation, delivered personally by a senior senator, represented a moment of institutional recognition that Langston had been denied for decades. As public pressure mounted, BlakeTech's board of directors called an emergency meeting. With the company's stock in freefall and clients abandoning ship, they voted unanimously to place Dorian on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Desperate and increasingly isolated, Dorian made preparations to flee. He contacted an offshore banking representative about liquidating emergency funds and arranged for his private helicopter to be fueled and ready at his estate's helipad. What he didn't know was that a junior systems analyst at BlakeTech, inspired by Langston's courage and disgusted by the emerging evidence against the company, had been monitoring Dorian's communications. An anonymous tip to federal authorities detailed Dorian's escape plans and financial movements. The morning Dorian attempted to board his helicopter, federal agents were waiting. The arrest was captured by news drones hovering just outside his property line. Footage of the once powerful CEO being handcuffed and led to a waiting vehicle, his empire crumbling around him. The charges were extensive: obstruction of justice, conspiracy, fraud, evidence tampering, and accessory after the fact in Marcus Holloway's death. While some charges related to recent events, others reached back to his knowledge of and benefit from his father's criminal activities with Project Goliath. As Dorian was processed at the Federal Detention Center, Elliot Voss moved to capitalize on BlakeTech's vulnerability. Through intermediaries, he approached Kaya with an offer to fund a foundation dedicated to compensating Goliath victims and their families, with Kaya as its public face and Voss's organization providing financial backing. "Think of what we could accomplish together," his representative told her. "Your family's name could become synonymous with redemption rather than corruption." The offer was tempting, particularly the promise of substantial compensation for veterans who had suffered for decades. But something about the arrangement made Kaya uneasy, a sense that she was being maneuvered into a role that served Voss's agenda more than justice. She was considering the proposal when Ghost appeared at her apartment, having slipped past building security with his usual ease. "Voss isn't the savior he pretends to be," Ghost told her without preamble. "He's using your pain to advance his game. Using all of us." "He's offering real help," Kaya countered. "Millions for the victims." "At what price?" Ghost challenged. "Control of the narrative? Ownership of the cause?" Voss didn't spend years tracking this story because of abstract principles. His brother was one of us, a test subject who died. "This is personal for him." Kaya considered Ghost's words carefully. "Personal doesn't mean wrong." "No," Ghost agreed, "but it means he has his own endgame. And I'm not convinced it stops with justice for the victims." After Ghost left, Kaya made her decision. She declined Voss's formal offer, choosing instead to establish a smaller independent initiative focused on truth and reconciliation rather than financial settlements alone. The decision cost her millions in potential funding, but preserved her autonomy and integrity. At the hospital, Langston received an unexpected delivery, a sealed envelope addressed in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was a letter written by Colonel James Vaughn shortly before his death, entrusted to his attorney with instructions to deliver it only if certain conditions were met. "Rhodes," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I've failed to bring them to justice, but you've somehow found a way. You were right about everything. The drugs, the cover-up, Blake's involvement. They're watching me now, monitoring my calls, following my movements. I won't survive this fight, but I want you to know I tried. You're a quiet lion, Rhodes, fierce when necessary, but wise enough to know when to wait. I hope that wisdom serves you well in the battles ahead." The letter ended with a list of names, military officers and corporate executives involved in Project Goliath. many of whom had risen to positions of significant power in the intervening years. Langston folded the letter carefully, a sense of closure washing over him. Colonel Vaughn hadn't abandoned the fight. He had been silenced, just as they had tried to silence Langston and Ghost. 3 days later, against medical advice but with stubborn determination, Langston checked himself out of the hospital. A small crowd of supporters had gathered outside, having maintained a vigil throughout his stay. They erupted in applause as he emerged, still weakened but standing tall. Near the hospital entrance, he paused before a freshly painted mural spanning the side of a building. The artwork depicted him and Ghost in their younger days, standing, back to back, with their current older selves as shadows behind them. Below the image, the artist had added a simple inscription: "From mud to metal, a hero reclaimed." Langston studied the mural, a complex mix of emotions crossing his weathered face. Recognition felt foreign after decades of invisibility. Justice felt tentative after years of resignation. But most surprising was the sense of purpose that had awakened within him, a realization that his final act of service might be his most important. As cameras flashed and reporters called questions, Langston Rhodes, once a decorated captain, then a forgotten whistleblower, then an invisible street cleaner, and now a reluctant symbol of long-delayed justice, straightened his shoulders and prepared to face the world on his own terms. The muddy water that had once splashed across his uniform had set in motion a cleansing tide that would wash away decades of lies, bringing truth to the surface at last. The East Room of the White House gleamed under the chandeliers, filled to capacity with distinguished guests in military dress uniforms and formal attire. At the center of attention stood Langston Rhodes, his weathered face solemn as the president approached with a small blue box in hand. "Captain Langston Rhodes," the president announced, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "Today we correct a grave injustice. This Congressional Medal of Honor was awarded to you posthumously 20 years ago, then buried in classified files when it became clear you had survived to speak truths that powerful interests wished to silence." A murmur went through the crowd as the president continued. "Your extraordinary valor during Operation Dustlight saved 14 American lives, including that of Lieutenant Dorian Blake. Your subsequent courage in exposing Project Goliath demonstrated a different kind of bravery, one that our nation failed to honor at the time." The president opened the box, revealing the medal's gleaming surface. "On behalf of a grateful nation, I present you with the recognition that was your due 2 decades ago." As the medal was placed around his neck, Langston stood tall despite the emotion evident in his eyes. When offered the podium to speak, he approached slowly, surveying the room filled with military brass, politicians, and media. "This medal doesn't belong to me alone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "It belongs to the 17 men from my unit who died not in combat, but from the effects of unauthorized drug trials. It belongs to Tyrone Merritt, who stood beside me when others wouldn't. It belongs to Colonel James Vaughn, who paid the ultimate price for seeking truth." Langston touched the medal at his chest. "I accept this recognition not for myself, but for those still waiting in silence. The forgotten victims of expedient decisions made by powerful men who never had to face the consequences." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 3 minutes, with even the most hardened military officials visibly moved. In the front row, Detective Eliza Vaughn discreetly wiped away tears, thinking of her father who had died never knowing if justice would come. Also in attendance was Kaya Blake, who had become a constant presence at Langston's side through the Senate hearings, media appearances, and medical appointments that had filled the past months. Her documentary series, Buried Honor: The Goliath Conspiracy, had won critical acclaim and helped shape the national conversation on military accountability. Following the ceremony, Kaya launched her nonprofit organization, From the Shadows, dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and veterans affected by classified military programs. Her first press conference drew national attention. "For too long, we've asked our service members to bear the burden of secrecy, even when that secrecy conceals wrongdoing," she told the assembled reporters. "From the Shadows will provide legal, financial, and emotional support to those who risk everything to tell difficult truths, The organization's first donors included several high-profile business leaders and celebrities, but noticeably absent was Elliot Voss, whose overtures Kaya had continued to politely rebuff. His congratulatory flowers arrived at her office with a note reading simply, "You've chosen a harder path. I respect that. The offer remains open." While Langston and Kaya were becoming the public faces of the growing movement for military transparency, Ghost maintained his preference for working behind the scenes. One crisp autumn morning, he made a solitary journey to Arlington National Cemetery, navigating the endless rows of white markers until he reached a particular grave. Unlike Tyrone Merritt's empty grave, this one held the remains of Staff Sergeant Michael Wells, one of the few true friends Ghost had made during his service, a man who had died in his arms during Operation Dustlight. Ghost knelt before the headstone, removing his old military ID tags from around his neck. He placed them gently atop the marker, his fingers lingering on the cold stone. "We told the truth, Mike," he said quietly. "It's done now." As Ghost rose to leave, he noticed a slender figure watching from a respectful distance, Detective Vaughn, who had taken to checking on the principal figures in the Goliath H case with increasing frequency as threats against them mounted. "Thought I'd find you here," she said as he approached. "The Attorney General is reopening all the cases connected to Colonel Vaughn's original investigation. They've assigned me to head the task force." Ghost nodded, unsurprised. "Your father would be proud." "They've recovered his original files," Vaughn continued, "including his notes on you and Rhodes. He knew you were still alive, even when everyone else bought the cover story." A rare smile crossed Ghost's face. "Your old man was sharp. Couldn't fool him with a fake death certificate. He wrote that you two were the most reliable witnesses he'd ever encountered," Vaughn said. High praise from James Vaughn. They walked together through the quiet cemetery, an unlikely alliance formed through shared pursuit of long-delayed justice. As they reached the main gate, Vaughn's phone buzzed with an alert. "The judge just denied Dorian Blake's bail appeal," she informed Ghost. "He'll remain in custody until trial." The trial of Dorian Blake had become a media sensation, with daily coverage of each new revelation. The prosecution's case was built on three pillars: Dorian's knowledge of and benefit from his father's criminal activities, his active role in suppressing evidence over the years, and his involvement in Marcus Holloway's death. While the first two charges were supported by substantial documentation, the third hinged on circumstantial evidence and testimony from Blake Tech employees who had observed Dorian's increasingly erratic behavior in the days before Holloway's death. The defense team fought vigorously on this point, arguing that stress and poor judgment were not the same as criminal intent. The most dramatic moment came when Langston took the stand as a surprise witness, coming face to face with Dorian for the first time since the muddy water incident that had started it all. "Captain Rhodes," the prosecutor began, "could you describe your interaction with the defendant during Operation Dustlight?" Langston's testimony was measured and precise, detailing how he had led the rescue mission that extracted Lieutenant Blake and the surviving members of his platoon after they were ambushed. "He was severely wounded," Langston recalled, "delirious with fever from an infected leg wound. I carried him approximately 2 miles to the extraction point." "And did he ever acknowledge this rescue?" "No," Langston replied simply. "He was evacuated immediately for medical treatment. Our paths didn't cross again until recently." "Recently?" the prosecutor prompted. "Yes, when he deliberately drove through a puddle to splash me while I was working as a street cleaner." Throughout this testimony, Dorian sat rigid in his chair, his eyes fixed on Langston. Something in the older man's calm recounting seemed to finally penetrate the defensive shell Dorian had built around himself. As Langston described carrying him to safety through enemy territory, Dorian's expression changed. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even shame, crossing his features. When court adjourned for the day, reporters captured the moment when Dorian turned to look directly at Langston. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Dorian mouthed 2 words that were clearly visible to the cameras. "I remember." Whether he meant the rescue, the betrayal, or both remained unclear. While the trial dominated headlines, Langston tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He returned to the same street corner he had swept for years, not because he needed the job anymore. Generous donations and speaking fees had secured his financial future, but because the simple act of cleaning grounded him amid the whirlwind his life had become. Locals who had previously ignored him now stopped to chat or ask for autographs. Children brought him drawings. One morning, he arrived to find his usual bench adorned with flowers and thank you notes from veterans' families. "Uncle Lang!" Langston turned to see Kaya approaching, coffee cups in hand. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had expected, a surrogate family bond that filled voids in both their lives. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him a cup. "You're trending again today." Langston accepted the coffee with a chuckle. "For an old man who spent decades trying to be invisible, I seem to be doing a poor job of it lately." They sat together on the bench, watching morning commuters rush past. Many now recognized Langston and offered nods or smiles of acknowledgement. "Speaking at Berkeley next week," Kaya mentioned. "Would you read my speech before I go? I value your perspective." "I'd be honored," Langston replied, genuine pride warming his voice. These quiet moments with Kaya had become precious to him, a chance to mentor the bright, passionate young woman who had, against all odds, become like family. He listened to her ideas, offered gentle guidance when asked, and watched with quiet satisfaction as she built something meaningful from the ashes of her family's disgrace. Meanwhile, Elliot Voss had seemingly disappeared from the public eye. His charitable foundation continued its work, but the man himself had not been seen at functions or events for weeks. Rumors circulated. He was ill, he was traveling, he was preparing for a major announcement. The truth, known only to his closest associates, was that Voss had retreated to his mountain compound to regroup and recalibrate. The Geolayat H expose had accomplished much of what he'd hoped, but Kaya's refusal to align with him had disrupted his broader strategy. "Perhaps we misjudged her," his assistant suggested during a strategy meeting. "No," Voss replied, studying, a wall of screens displaying news coverage of the Blake trial. "We underestimated her independence. Different problem entirely." "And Rhodes?" "A man of principle," Voss acknowledged with grudging respect. "Harder to manipulate than anticipated." "Should we distance ourselves from the entire operation?" Ray considered this, then shook his head. "No, we maintain support from a distance. Let others take the public credit for now. Our time will come." His assistant noted the cold calculation in Voss's voice. "Sir, if I may ask, is this still about justice for your brother, or has it become something else?" Voss's expression hardened. "Men like Blake don't just vanish, Thompson. They wait for the spotlight to shift, then re-emerge, rebranded and rehabilitated. I'm playing a longer game." Back in the city, as fall gave way to winter, Langston experienced something he hadn't felt in decades: peace. The Senate hearings had concluded with sweeping recommendations for military oversight. The first criminal convictions, related to Project Geolayat, had been secured. Compensation funds for victims' families were being established. One evening, as soft snow fell outside his window, Langston sat in his modest apartment. He had refused more luxurious accommodations despite his newfound resources, and watched. The snowflakes illuminate briefly in the streetlight before continuing their descent. For the first time in 20 years, he slept without nightmares. Spring brought new beginnings across the city. Trees budded along the streets Langston had once swept, and construction crews cleared the last remnants of winter grime from sidewalks and gutters. In his apartment, Langston sat at a small desk, pen in hand, carefully composing a letter. 2. "The next one who's ignored," he began, the words flowing more easily than he had expected. "You may not wear a uniform or carry a medal. Your battlefields might be office corridors or factory floors or city streets, but if you stand witness to wrong and choose to speak despite the cost, know that you are not alone. Some truths take decades to be heard. Some justice arrives late. But silence serves only those who abuse power, while speech, even when it seems to fall on deaf ears, plants seeds that may grow in unexpected seasons." Langston continued writing well into the night, pouring decades of hard-earned wisdom onto the pages. He wrote about courage and patience, about the weight of secrets and the freedom of truth. He wrote about finding dignity in humble work and purpose in persistent principle. When he finished, he made a single copy and gave it to Kaya, who recognized its power immediately. With Langston's permission, she published it on the From the Shadows website. Within days, it had been shared millions of times, translated into 27 languages, and read aloud at rallies supporting whistleblowers around the world. "Your letter has gone viral, Uncle Lang," Kaya told him over dinner at his favorite local diner. The White House press secretary was asked about it today. Langston shook his head in amazement. An old street cleaner's ramblings. Who would have thought? "You've never been just a street cleaner," Kaya said softly. "That's what everyone sees now." As Langston's letter continued to resonate globally, plans were finalized for a more permanent recognition of the Goliath whistleblowers. On a bright spring morning, a crowd gathered in front of the Capitol, building for the unveiling of a bronze statue. The sculpture depicted Langston and Ghost standing back to back, Langston with his broom, Ghost with his dog tags. At their feet lay a small plaque inscribed with the words, "Truth stands tall." Senator Eleanor Williams, who had chaired the Goliath hearings, addressed the assembled crowd. "This monument stands as a reminder that our nation's strength lies not in our ability to keep secrets, but in our courage to face difficult truths." Captain Rhodes and Sergeant Merritt could have chosen comfortable silence. Instead, they endured decades of obscurity and danger to ensure that justice, though delayed, would not be denied. As the covering was removed, revealing the bronze figures gleaming in the sunlight, applause erupted from the crowd. Langston, standing with Kaya and Detective Vaughn, felt a strange dissonance, seeing himself immortalized in bronze. The man with the broom represented something larger than himself now, a symbol that had taken on a life of its own. Ghost was noticeably absent from the ceremony. The previous evening, he had visited Langston's apartment for what both men somehow knew would be their final conversation. "I'm leaving, Lang," Ghost had said without preamble. "Heading to the mountains. Time to live in silence again, but on my terms this time." Langston had nodded, understanding perfectly. "The spotlight never suited you." "We lit the fire," Ghost said, embracing his old friend. "Let others keep it burning." Their goodbye was brief but profound. Two men who had survived hell together, who had kept each other's secrets for decades, who had finally seen vindication arrive in their lifetimes. "Be well, Ty," Langston had said, using Ghost's real name for the first time in years. "You too, Captain," Ghost replied with a rare smile, before disappearing into the night as silently as he had arrived. At the courthouse across town, the verdict in Dorian Blake's trial sent shockwaves through the financial and defense sectors. Guilty on 14 counts including conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Not guilty on the most serious charge of involvement in Marcus Holloway's death, where the evidence had ultimately proven too circumstantial. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, with legal experts predicting a term of 7 to 10 years in federal prison. For a man who had once commanded a corporate empire worth billions, it represented a spectacular fall. When the verdict was read, Dorian seemed to collapse inward, all pretense of arrogance finally stripped away. In that moment of reckoning, he looked directly at Langston, who had attended every day of the trial. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of the tangled threads that had bound their lives together. Outside the courthouse, a reporter thrust a microphone toward Langston. "Captain Rhodes, does today's verdict feel like justice to you?" Langston considered the question carefully. "Justice isn't a moment or a verdict," he replied. "It's a process, often slow, sometimes incomplete. Today is just one step in that process." "And your personal feelings toward Dorian Blake?" A thoughtful expression crossed Langston's face. "I carried him out of a jungle once. I hope he finds his way out of this jungle too." The weeks following the verdict brought a flurry of speaking invitations for Langston, but he accepted only a select few, prioritizing veterans events and educational institutions where young people might learn from his experiences. Kaya's graduation, speech at her alma mater drew particular attention. Standing before thousands of graduates, she spoke powerfully about legacy and responsibility. "My family name once stood for wealth and influence," she told the hushed audience. "Now it stands as a cautionary tale about the corruption of power. But I've learned from a wiser teacher, a man who once swept the streets where many of you walked without noticing him. He taught me that we don't inherit our worth, we demonstrate it through our choices." She paused, making eye contact with Langston, who sat on the stage among the university dignitaries. He said something I'll never forget: "Clean the dirt, but never let them dirty your soul." That wisdom applies whether you're starting at the bottom or the top, whether you're sweeping streets or leading corporations. Your integrity is not determined by your position, but by your principles. The commencement address went viral, further cementing Kaya's reputation as a thoughtful voice for a new generation of socially conscious leaders. Job offers poured in from prestigious organizations, but she remained committed to From the Shadows, which had grown to include a legal defense fund and a mental health support network for whistleblowers. As summer approached, Langston found himself drawn back to the street corner where it had all begun. The city had long since reassigned his old route to another worker, but he still felt a connection to the place where muddy water had washed away his carefully constructed anonymity. He arrived early one morning, watching as the neighborhood came to life around him. Shop owners raised their shutters, commuters hurried toward the subway entrance, children skipped toward school. Most were unaware of the history that had unfolded. On this ordinary corner, a sleek black car approached the intersection where Dorian's SUV had once splashed through the puddle. This time, however, the driver slowed carefully, avoiding the water that had pooled after an overnight rain. As the car passed, the driver, a young executive type, nodded respectfully toward Langston before continuing on his way. The simple gesture brought a smile to Langston's face. Perhaps something had changed after all. From a small equipment shed nearby, Langston retrieved a broom that the current maintenance worker had left leaning against the wall. The handle felt familiar in his weathered hands, a connection to the years he had spent in quiet service to this small corner of the world. He began to sweep, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. One final time, he cleared debris from the street corner, working methodically until the pavement was clean. As he swept, he noticed a discarded newspaper in the gutter. The front page bore his own image, a photograph from the medal ceremony at the White House. He picked it up, chuckling at the irony, and deposited it in a nearby trash bin. When he finished, he returned the broom to its place and sat on the bench to watch the city pass by. A sense of completion settled over him, a circle closing, a story finding its natural end. Nearby, a figure stood observing, the same mysterious watcher who had been present the day of the splash. Now revealed to be a freelance journalist named Maya Wilson, she had documented the entire saga from that first viral moment to this quiet epilogue. She approached Langston, introducing herself properly for the first time. "You know," she said, sitting beside him on the bench, "I've been covering this story since that SUV splashed you. I've always wondered, did you have any idea what you were setting in motion that day?" Langston smiled. "Life rarely warns us when it's about to change course, Ms. Wilson. We just try to stay on our feet when the wave hits." "Any regrets?" she asked. "About how it all unfolded?" Langston gazed out at the busy street, watching people rush past, most still strangers to each other, but perhaps a little more aware of the hidden stories walking among them. "They may not clap for you," he said finally, "but do what's right, anyway." As Maya Wilson turned to the camera her colleague had discreetly set up, she delivered the closing lines of what would become an award-winning documentary. "This is how a man turns mud into gold." The screen faded to black, but Langston Rhodes, street cleaner, soldier, whistleblower, reluctant hero, remained on that bench a while longer, watching over his corner of the world one last time. Have you ever wondered how many heroes sweep our streets, unrecognized until the moment truth can no longer stay buried? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share to support more untold tales of justice long delayed but never denied.